You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. Okay, here we go. I am your host for today, John Wood Jr., joined by a marvelous panel of Braver Angels leaders and friends, including my good buddy Luke Nathan Phillips, who is editor of opinion content at braverangels.org, Sage Snyder, who is director of arts and culture at Braver Angels, and a guest that we are very pleased to welcome, Miss Phillipa Hughes, who we will all be learning more about in a moment. Luke, Sage, Phillipa, how you guys doing today?
Really good.
Happy to be here.
Doing great.
Outstanding. Okay, so we have some, first of all, I want to preface our conversation today by saying we have some big news at Braver Angels, and I'm going to invite Sage to speak a little bit about this, but we have launched a songwriting competition that has some big names in the music world behind it. We are reaching out to artists and songwriters across the country to get in touch with us, to share with us a piece of music that captures the spirit of Braver Angels. There's cash prizes and publicity involved in this, but what it's really about, of course, is bringing the country together in a spirit that can sort of save the heart of our democracy. But Sage, can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, Braver Angels is launching its first major music initiative. We wanted to find a way to support artists during this difficult time, as well as bring in some new voices and artistic experiences for all our members. So we have put out a call to artists to show their Braver Angels and send us songs that express whatever Braver Angels and our work means to them. We have the support of Peter Yarrow. He's really excited about this. I think he sees it a little bit as like trying to bring what he did in the 1960s to the divided politics of America today. We also have the support of Steve Seskin, who has
and just so people know who might not know, Sage, Peter Yarrow is Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary, right? The group behind such amazing songs is Blowing in the Wind and just a long list of hits. And the creator of Puff the Magic Dragon, which for people my age, I think will be particularly familiar. But yeah, just wanted to note that.
If there was ever a song that could bring people together, I think it's Puff the Magic Dragon.
I think so. America needs Puff more than ever.
Steve Seskin, who has himself written, sometimes with Red writing partners, some fantastic songs for Braver Angels. And recently, it's actually, I guess I'm announcing this for the first time right now, but Aaron Barker is also going to be a celebrity Red judge who has written some incredible hit songs, and I think will bring a much needed perspective to our judging panel. And then we've got a whole committee of people in Braver Angels who are supporting this project, and I hope lots of people enter their songs. We look forward to hearing what you write.
100%. Yeah, no, I'm excited about this. Sage, tell folks a little bit about yourself, because really, Sage, you are the one who's been leading this project. I mean, I would love to just brag about you all day long in terms of what a great musician, artist you are. But tell folks a little bit about who you are, because Braver Angels members and followers are going to be learning more about Sage Snyder.
Sure. Well, I think the relationship between art and politics has always been my primary interest. When I was in college, I studied the great books. I majored in intellectual and political history, but most of that I studied through the lens of art history, including theater and music and visual art. And simultaneously, I was also a musician myself. So I started playing at Yale in the Yale Symphony Orchestra, but I had a little personal crisis while I was in college and decided to quit the orchestra after my sophomore year and join a local bluegrass band. And I loved bluegrass, and I decided I was just going to go for it. And I volunteered to put up posters for a local band, and eventually they asked me to join and said they'd teach me how to play. So I did that through college, and then after college, I did an internship at the Smithsonian of American History, where they asked me to make a Civil War fiddling program in their war history exhibit. So I got really into Civil War music, which is a great place to talk about the intersection between music and politics, and specifically how divided America is,
You bet.
um, or has been. Then after that, I played in a rock band in rural Vermont at a resort. And then I went to grad school for American music history and museums. And then I moved to Nashville, which is where I currently live. And here I've played in tons of bluegrass bands. I play with musicians across the political spectrum, which is something that I've always loved about music, is meeting people who come from different backgrounds than me. And I currently play in a pirate band. It's a whole pirate music subculture, which I've learned about since moving here. If there's a subculture in music, it's in Nashville. This is the place to find it, right? And then I also wrote a show for Braver Angels, at the time Better Angels, and toured up the East Coast for it, and have played in a bunch of benefit concerts. And now I'm leading the arts initiative for Braver Angels and trying to find more substantive ways to get the arts into what we do.
Yeah. And well, it's an amazing new dimension to fold into our work. And for me, it's quite natural. There's so much, debate and dialogue in politics, and that's, par for the course, of course. But, culture and art and music gives us a language to connect with each other on that goes beyond what you can just articulate intellectually, right? And so on that note, Philip, I want to bring you into the conversation and have us learn more about you, because I know that you have real thoughts and deep experience in this same sort of intersection. I think the intersection of our social divisions and art's capacity to sort of bridge some of these divides. So tell us about yourself, what it is that you do. I think that you've got a history and a vocation here that people are really going to find relevant to this subject.
Yeah, thanks, John. Before I kind of get too much into myself, or I want to talk about a little bit about what Sage was saying, because, she has this whole long history of how art and politics can be integrated together.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not start out that way. I thought art was like pretty pictures by Monet, the water lilies. And, I had that poster that every college dorm room has with the water lilies. And, so I just never thought about art and politics together. And so but I kind of like the way that we've kind of I've gotten to that point now, because part of the reason is because I've been doing, I've been calling myself a amateur social scientist now, because I've been doing all this social science research, and I found this organization called the Greater Good Science Center. It's actually out of Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
And
they
do, yeah. So they do this research around awe and wonder, and how awe and wonder can be used to create a sense of curiosity about the world and about each other, about other humans. And so when we feel more curiosity, we feel more empathy. That's the theory, and they've shown that through social science. And so then they back that up a little bit to say, well, how do we create a sense of awe and wonder? You can certainly feel it when you see a beautiful sunset or a beautiful vista out in nature. Nature is a very strong provocateur of awe. But how can we do that through art? And how do we create the sense that you are part of something bigger in the world, and that you don't, and also a sense of humility that you don't know everything, and that's why you need to ask questions, and that's why you need to be curious. So that's the point, that's the little intersection that I kind of have pulled out and gotten really interested in. How do we use art, music, culture to create that sense of awe and wonder in people who are not seeing eye to eye on the political spectrum, and use that to help them connect, because they feel this greater sense of curiosity, because they have seen this great sense of awe. Anyway, so that's what I've been working on with a project called Looking for America.
That's okay. That's phenomenal. So tell us about Looking for America. So what is the focus of this? How are you accomplishing this extraordinary objective of instilling awe and wonder in people as a means of transcending these divides? Yeah, we really want to hear it.
Well, it's a big experiment still. And in fact, I've had a couple great conversations with Sage about how, like, all this stuff, because one of the things that I really have to, I've experimented with so many, I was just telling her, I went to a little workshop with Narrative 4 right before we got on the call here. And they're using storytelling to build more empathy. I go to all the workshops. I've read all the books. So the more I read and learn, the more I realize how little I actually know. So that's kind of been interesting. And so that was a long way of basically saying, it's all an experiment, we're just trying all different kinds of things. But one of the things that I really want to get at is that I want to get away from the idea of, I want to de-objectify art. I don't want art to, when I say the word art, most of the time, and I get this, of course, people think of that thing that hangs on the wall or that sculpture that's sitting on the floor. And I want to get away from art as objects. And I want to get to the idea that art is about our experiences. It's about like our interactions, and not in the way that cooking as an art form, but like as the fact that we're creating something together as we're having this dialogue. It's about the process of creation as much as it is anything else, and not about necessarily the product. I appreciate the product. I love collecting art. I love listening to music, all the things. But for me, I'm more drawn to the process of the making and the creation.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal insight, I think. We were having a conversation. We recorded a podcast recently that isn't out yet as of the recording of this podcast, but we spoke with the actress and comedian Bridget Fetisi, who's when we talked about humor, and humor's sort of ability to cut through the fog of difference in politics. And I remembered a quote from Jay Leno, who talked about how when we're laughing at something, it transcends political differences, because in the moment we're laughing, we're seeing things the same way. And it sounds like in the context of art, you're describing something which, is just a sort of another dimension of impact in that way. When we create art, we have to pull from some common place, I think, of the sort of human spirit to sort of deliver something that actually resonates, right? So,
well, I think that there's a common spirit, and then we're all coming at it from different perspectives, and we should celebrate all the differences in the way we come at it. And in fact, I think, Sage, we were talking about how, like, a lot of times too, we say art, and frankly, the first thing that pops into my head is a bunch of liberal people, and so I am really trying to be careful about this idea that art isn't, in fact, I try not to even use the word art in greater circles, because it does evoke a certain idea of liberalness, I think. I don't know. What do you think, Sage?
I think, like, when you talk about the importance of process as being something that's what's important in music, especially when I'm not playing for money, when I'm playing for fun with people, which is why I started doing this. It is about the process. It's not about the product. We're not recording. It's about the experience of making music together and the community that builds. And often that isn't liberals. It actually, especially in bluegrass, it really brings together people from many different backgrounds. And one of the things and in bluegrass itself, like, the way that the music is made is that there's various instruments are making in a band, and everybody has a very distinct role. And as long as everybody follows their role in the group with, like, clear division of labor, that's what makes the sound of bluegrass. So everybody has a distinct voice, and there's a moment for everybody to shine and everybody to be in the background as a supporting role. And it's that, like, interaction and that communication between each other of everybody contributing something different. Plus, a lot of these people really are very, very different people, because bluegrass attracts very red people and very blue people, like extremes. But they're able to take those different backgrounds, those different experiences, and contribute together and make this music that balances out all these voices. And it's because we have different voices that makes the art form so amazing for people like me who like bluegrass and don't think it's the most annoying music ever created. But
I want to look into bluegrass more.
Sage, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, Sage, you had told a story that has always stuck with me a little bit, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind revisiting it. You're a person whose politics are, I think it's fair to say, pretty strongly progressive, right? And you moved to Nashville, which is, generally, I think, probably a more conservative climate than Vermont and so forth. And I remember you telling a story once about, obviously you had fill in the details, but about seeing a group of, musicians somewhere who's, I mean, you knew their politics were probably, in a very pro-Trump direction, so forth, but then you heard them play and sing, and it was sort of an awe-inspiring experience, even though the social division was obviously there.
Well, actually, it was when I was
that for us?
So that was 10 years before I moved to Nashville, but it is why I moved.
So before Trump, but still, right.
But I basically, I wanted to learn bluegrass for reasons I don't even remember. I think I wanted to get into a band at school, and I thought it would be useful. So I went to a camp called Nash Camp in Nashville. It was out in rural Nashville, which is more conservative than where I live now. And I was a classical violinist trying to learn how to play bluegrass, and I kept going into my cabin and practicing as hard as I could because I thought I could catch up that way, because like I know how to practice for several hours by myself in a practice room, but nobody else was doing that, and all these people were so much better than me. Somebody told me eventually that like you can't learn music this way. You have to go out and play with people, and you have to listen to people. That's the way that you learn bluegrass. So I just like forced myself to go sit on the porch of my cabin where there were like some older guys rocking, literally, I mean, this sounds like a joke, but it's not. They were like rocking on rocking chairs and talking and sharing stories, and then maybe they'd play a tune and then they go back to talking. And I like didn't know how to talk with them or play music, so I just watched. And as a young girl, so I usually can get away with that. So I just like sat there and listened, and they told these stories that were like really offensive to me as like a Jewish liberal Yankee. They used some words that I would call racist that made me very uncomfortable, and they talked about their work. I think they worked in oil drilling. But then they would play music, and it was like the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard in my life, and I was so jealous. Like I really wanted to be able to participate and speak that language. And at that moment, I think it was just awe and wonder, if I use Phillipa's words. Like there was clearly something. It was so easy for me listening to them talk to think I was smarter than them and I knew more than they did. But when they played music, it was very clear that they had some understanding of the world that was far beyond mine, and that I really wanted to be able to engage with them. So that kind of initiated my dream to become a bluegrass player, which I've already explained sort of happened starting in college.
Yeah, well, that's transcendence in action, I think, and a beautiful illustration, I guess, of the power of, I mean, art, music, etc. To, I think, touch something deeper in us that gives us some higher language to work with, right? Luke, you are the historian in our midst here, although I will also, tell our listeners that Luke is not too bad on the ukulele. So he's got some musical chops here as well. Luke, just to kind of bring in your academic perspective, is there is there something that strikes you about the role of music in American history? Sage talked about Civil War music, and I can think of the music of the Civil Rights movement in the 1960s and how that provided the background for so much social change. Do you have a sense of, in history, where we kind of see the transcendent power of art, music, and other things in a way that maybe shines light on its power or potential power today?
Yeah, and first off, a full disclaimer to the listeners: John plays me up too much. I am not quite as scholarly as one might expect, but I do like to think about these things. So,
but he's even better on the ukulele. So that's.
So I think one of the interesting things about American national history is that a lot of the moments, particularly in the early 20th century when recording technology started to become more widely available, a lot of the moments that you associate with an emerging national consciousness from the First World War through the New Deal and Second World War up through the early Cold War and then the Civil Rights era usually have some kind of music associated with them. And that's not just purely because the recording technology was available then. That's also, I think, part of a sense that because as people had access to a shared kind of musical market, some songs just became popular. I mean, if you look at the popular music of World War I, it is really tacky and campy. But like you can kind of get a sense of like, oh, this is the first time that that Americans from Florida to California to Maine to Seattle are all listening to a similar thing in a similar cause, and so on and so forth through the New Deal. But one of the big projects of the Works Progress Administration in the New Deal was in the 1930s, back during the depths of the Great Depression, was to send historians out to different parts of the American countryside and the American cities, and record the folk music from all kinds of different groups of American people they heard out there, right? So this is one of the first times, and Sage, you're probably familiar with this history as well, that a lot of Appalachian folk music started to get recorded, right? This is also sometimes back in the Deep South that that a lot of the Black contribution to jazz was more fully and widely recognized in the American public consciousness than it had been in the 20s. And so I say all this to say that one of the things that I absolutely love about American history, more than the history of any other country that I study, is that like as you go through decade by decade in the American experience, particularly in the 20th century, you get a sense of like different musical aesthetics between the 1920s and the 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, right? Because of that, like there's something about what people enjoyed listening to at those that tells you something about the soul of each of those times. You know, we mentioned Peter Yarrow and the experience of the 1960s, but I think you could apply the same thing to the popularity of jazz once upon a time and all that kind of stuff. So that's most of my thought on that, but I have some other thoughts on kind of analogs to that earlier on as well.
Which always surprises me to learn that Luke has other thoughts on various subjects. But no, I appreciate the historical rundown, and you know, I mean, this means a lot to me personally because there's a real way in which I probably wouldn't exist without the cross current of music and culture in a way that changes society. For folks who don't know, I mean, I'm a bit of a rusty singer and musician myself. I play the trumpet, I sing. I come from a musical family. My father's a jazz musician, jazz pianist. My mother's an R&B singer. She danced on Soul Train in the early 80s and so forth. My dad's side of the family is white. My mom's side is black. They met in a recording studio that my grandfather owned from 1970 to 1995 in Los Angeles called Studio Masters. And my grandfather before that he owned the biggest independent record label in America in the late 1950s. And it was called Dot Records. It was Pat Boone's record label, Lawrence Welk, Billy Vaughn, the Dell Vikings, Mills Brothers for a time, Louis and Keeley, people like that. And prior to that, and again, Grandpa was a white man, but Grandpa, Randy Wood, he founded a radio show sponsored by a mail-order record shop he owned called the Randy's Record Shop. It was the first radio show to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music, basically black music, to a national audience. And so, you know, it traveled mostly across the South, parts of the Midwest, and certain nights the signal would get into the Caribbean. Bob Marley recorded his early hits in a record studio called Randy's, which was named after the radio show, and indirectly, therefore, after my grandfather. But in so doing, launched the careers of artists like Mahalia Jackson and Arthur Alexander and Solomon Burke and many others. You know, Grandpa, and then in founding Dot, Grandpa had Pat Boone record Pat Boone's earliest hits were covers of black rhythm and blues singer songs like Tutti Frutti by Little Richard, who recently passed away. Fats Domino, Ain't That a Shame. Grandpa had a lot to do with the crossing over of black music into the American mainstream because, you know, many folks, Sage, you certainly be familiar with this, but many folks will be familiar with the sort of segregated history of American popular music around that time and the fact that, you know, a lot of black music had difficulty being introduced to the white mainstream for a period of time, but when it was covered by white artists, tended to be a little bit more palatable, at least initially, in marketing to the American mainstream. But after those covers, it sort of opened the door for some of those artists, some of those Black artists, to achieve wider distribution, following some of these covers. And so all of that happened in a period of time that preceded the civil, and then flowed into the civil rights movement, and the larger sort of integration of American society. So, a few decades later, I was born as kind of a, I guess, a descendant of that interaction a bit, through my own parents, who, if society hadn't desegregated in the way it did, and hadn't done so through music, probably wouldn't have met each other in the fashion that they did. So what I want to ask you here, Phillipa, is what is it that perhaps inspires you or gives you hope about the country right now in terms of music, art, and the work of inspiring awe? What is our potential for doing good here using these sorts of tools? What would you like to see flowering in the weeks and months and years to come?
Well, going back to that thing that I was saying about de-objectifying visual art, I'm really excited about the idea that what if people are hungry for these kinds of dialogues and interactions across the political spectrum. That's been my anecdotal personal experience as I've traveled around the country. And what we need to do is create space for those interactions to happen, because people are fearful, and I totally get that. It's very difficult to enter into a conversation where you don't know if the person's going to attack you or whatever. But if we can create that space, people will come. This has been my experience. And so when I think about de-objectifying art, I think about creating that space as the art practice. What can we create using our creative brains to allow people to have these conversations? And so there is actually like this sort of art practice called relational aesthetic, in which the idea is that the artist creates the space, and the art piece is not completed until people interact and have dialogue within the space. And that is a form of visual art practice called relational aesthetic. And so there's a pretty famous, or famous in the art world, guy named Joseph Beuys, who was very popular in the 70s, who practiced this art form, and he called himself a social sculptor. And so I have adopted this term, social sculptor. I want to sculpt space for social interaction to happen. And so I do feel very hopeful, because I know that, I am here for it. I am here to create these kind of spaces, because I know that people will enter them if they're invited in, if somebody does it. And I hope some others, I've worked with Luke here in DC to do that kind of thing. And I think that there are others like us out there, social sculptors.
Luke, I see you wanting to jump in with something here.
Yeah, just a little thing. Phillipa, the more I've talked with you and listened to your thoughts on the social aspect of aesthetics, right? The more I've seen parallels with the ostensibly nowadays conservative tradition of just ritual, right? Rituals in all kinds of things. I mean, there's a lot of things that are rituals that we don't really think of as rituals, things like marriages, things like promotion parties, things like proms, all that kind of stuff. And my part-time boss, David Brooks, has been an advocate of increasing the kind of number and frequency of rituals of various sorts, mostly minor kinds of things, but just to add a little more of the sacred into an otherwise mundane public life, right? Just adding ritual to imbue more meaning into more kinds of things, right? And the more I listen to you talking about ways to bring people together in pursuit of awe and wonder and beauty, the more it occurs to me that, like, yeah, there's a conservative tradition of doing that too. That's probably more based on on like the structures rather than the substance of it. But there's definitely like it's something that could have a broad appeal, if you designed it right.
Well, actually, I mean, I will just say that I don't think it's necessarily a conservative
Yeah.
appeal. I mean, it's a basic human desire for rituals to understand the world. It's a way for us to help understand the world better. And there's actually a great book that came out last or the year before called The Art of Gathering. And she talks a lot about the idea that of creating ritual. Like, you can't just put people in a room together and expect them to have a great conversation. Like, maybe it will happen, but there are things you can do to make it more possible that a meaningful, deeper conversation will happen. And she talks a lot about creating a sense of ritual, a sense of we're entering a different kind of space and we're gonna do a thing together, and it's awesome.
Right. Now, I'm very intrigued by that, and of course, it's got to be wholly correct. Shout out to Eric Liu at Citizens University, who's done a lot through Citizens University and the Civic Laboratory project to sort of catalyze a resurgence of ritual building in our civic space in ways that bring people together through shared experiences, as opposed to just through dialogue. That's a part of it, right? But actually doing things together is how we build a culture that sort of sustains us, I think, beyond these divides. Sage, here's a question, and hopefully it's not an unfair question, but if we looked at this kind of from a negative frame, if we said, rather than asking the question, what good can we do through art and music to bring people together, what do you think happens if we don't use these tools? If all we do is debate and argue in politics and try to intellectually persuade people to get along, see the best in each other, but we leave our fiddles and our trumpets and our singing voices and our artistry at home. If we leave that out, what do we lose?
Well, first of all, I think we should be clear that the arts are a tool, and they can equally be used for all the things we're fighting as much as they can be used to bring people together. So using or including them is not necessarily a good thing. It's how we're using them or why we're using them.
I see.
But if we talk about removing them, I think, Phillipa, I hope you'll talk about food at some point, because
I forgot about the food aspect.
It's a relevant thing here, and then related to your programs for bringing people together. But if all people do is communicate politics the way that they usually communicate politics, putting them in a room to talk about it isn't going to make them communicate any differently than they're already failing to talk about it. I mean, it is true, maybe it's better that people are face to face and they can talk to real human beings, since the internet has a problem with dehumanizing people and making people anonymous. But if we're used to speaking in a certain way and our languages just don't overlap the way we talk about politics, we use words that mean different things to different people, or we use phrases that are like our side's phrases of framing the battles, like I'm not sure how constructive conversation is going to be. I don't think anybody listening to this needs any persuasion that conversations fail very easily. It's very hard to have a good, productive political conversation. And Braver Angels does a really good job of trying to shape that. But I mean, Braver Angels has used music as a tool to try to give people like the very first workshop Peter Yarrow played at the end, and like people wanted to get through the weekend, I think, because they got a private concert with them at the end, and that's what they got to do, something fun together that they were all really excited about, and that maybe helped some of them push through the really miserable parts of talking about politics. So I mean, I think it can trigger feelings between people, to unify people. I mean, there's so many different things music can do that's useful. I think, though, like if we look at art in this very broad social controlling sense that Philip is talking about, then Braver Angels is already integrating this into everything that they're doing. They're thinking really intentionally about how people relate at a deeper level than just like literally what they're saying.
Right. Phillipa, do you want to add to that, or does that stir any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks, Sage, for reminding me a very critical component of Looking for America is the breaking bread piece. Right. Because we all know breaking bread, that phrase exists for a reason. It can actually bring people together. And it all started, this whole project started 3 days after the 2016 election, when I invited people who voted for Donald Trump to come to my house for dinner. And I made dinner for people around my little dining table, and we just argued and talked. Yeah, like that. We did that. And it was amazing. I mean, it was hard. And, I know that I am sort of I'm naturally inclined to invite people over often, so it's easier for somebody like me. So I get why it's hard for others to just invite somebody in your home and start, and knowing that you very deeply disagree. But we have to do that because there is something very powerful about literally sharing food together. Now, in this moment of quarantine, when we can't actually share food together, and it is really hard to have these kind of dialogues, I've been very skeptical and resistant to using Zoom as a way to like bring people together. And then I finally had to throw in the towel because we don't know how long this is going to last for real. Maybe it'll resurge. And so I started experimenting with having cross-political dialogues via Zoom. And it actually, okay, so then I was like, okay, that's not so bad. We like got, give some guidelines, we tweak a little bit, cool. So I'm warming up to it. But the thing that was missing was, how are we going to share food together? Like it's really important to me that we break bread together. And so I had like this idea that maybe I would cook food and I would like freeze it and ship it to everybody, and they just thawed out, we'd eat together. And then I had this idea that I would send people recipes and maybe the supplies, and they would make, but I didn't want to have people make food, like have to put them through that. So we actually have this really cool summer series going on, and you all are very welcome to join. We're going to conduct little Zoom conversations just like this with 5 to 6 people, well, actually 4 to 5 people. And we're having food sent to everybody from the places where the participants are from. So for example, Sioux City, they have a flavored popcorn factory that's part of Jolly Time. It's called Coated Kernels. And so they're sending flavored popcorn to every participant. And in El Paso, salsa and chips. So we're sending, packaged food, so that it's something you don't have to prepare. And so the idea is, it's not a real meal, but it's a way to symbolize the idea that we're gonna like eat something together and have like a shared experience. Mm-hmm. So anyway, food, I just think is very much at the core, as much as the art piece.
I also love that reminds people that they all share their community. Like it reminds them of something they have that does unify them, that they all care about, and that hopefully they're all there because they want to make their community better. I think like arts in general can remind people of maybe these like deeper connections or values that people might have that sometimes we forget when we talk about the surface of things in political language.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's well, obviously that's a big part of sort of community building in a religious context. So much of culture is sort of based in what it is we communicate in a culinary fashion and then in eating together, right? And I love the fact that, this is such a rare conversation we're having here, because we're talking in the context of this political and social divide in a way that's actually sort of appealing to the 5 senses as opposed to just one, right? And it may be that's really the type of kind of holistic approach that needs to be taken, that Braver Angels needs to take to this question. Luke, I think you had something to add here.
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things about talking about whatever you want to call it, national identity or shared culture or shared heritage or whatever, if you try to do it using explicitly rational means, if you try to do it like by saying like, oh, what does it mean to be an American? It's X, Y, Z, A, B, C, but not Q, R, and S. When you do that, you get into all kinds of political wranglings about like, well, this person who is definitely American is definitely with that and not with that. How can you do so? When you try to do it in a rational sense, and I hear this all the time when I see when I listen to podcasts or read articles of various intellectuals trying to define what the American ideas are, right? It's very easy for that to get into either like counting how many angels can fit on the head of a needle, or get into something that is that they don't think is partisan, but winds up being very partisan, right? However, when you bring aspects of culture into it, when you bring things that cannot be fully rationalized into it, things like music, things like visual art and poetry, things that stir people's souls and stuff like that, it's easier to get to a kind of agreement on those without really necessarily having to articulate why there's an agreement on those. Right. I think the example of Sage, the New Englander who is passionate about social justice and is as blue can be, falling deeply in love with the Appalachian tradition of bluegrass music, is just a stellar example of that. You know, and John, in your own past, the ways that American popular music in the mid 20th century brought your ancestors together across political divides, by the way, as well, is just another kind of example of that. So as we go more deeply into 2020 and the new decade ahead of us, one of the things I think about with American identity, which is one of my favorite subjects of all subjects to think about, is just that there's so much diversity of it, and there's so much bounty in that diversity. And just because you find something in it valuable doesn't mean that that necessarily defines the whole thing, but it can be something that a lot of people from across the whole spectrum find value in, you know? So
I watched a beautiful movie on Netflix the other day called Uncorked. I recommend it to anybody. And it's a movie about a young African-American man who lives at home with his parents. His father is a restaurateur. He owns a very successful barbecue restaurant. I think it's set in Memphis. Might have to double check, but he himself is being expected to. His father is hoping that he takes over. This young man named Elijah. His father is hoping that Elijah will take over the family business, just the way he took over the restaurant from his father. But Elijah has a passion for wine and wants to become what's called a sommelier. And I guess that is, you know, the person who you meet at the fancy French restaurant, who, if you ask him for a recommendation, will tell you everything about the vintage and the origin and the composition of a particular wine. And what I learned in this movie is that this is really an intensive sort of artistic science to develop your palate to be able to identify, you know, when a wine was curated and where the region that it originates from just by tasting it. But in the sort of contrast of, you know, Southern barbecue, right, versus wine culture, there's this major class differential between the son and the father that also introduces something of a cultural and even a racial division, because in becoming educated in wine, he's suddenly spending time with white people, with people who have a bit more education and more opportunities available to them, and he finds himself being cultured in just a different world than his father is familiar with. So it creates this rift between them. But after some tragedies in the family take place, part of what happens is that the father finally takes an interest in his son's passion, which is wine. And in coming to appreciate wine, he comes to appreciate his son's aspirations and ambitions and the world that his son is going into. And they're able to sort of reestablish their bond over their suddenly shared love of both wine and barbecue, right? And so, you know, it's amazing, the transcendence and the awe that comes in sharing these things that go beyond just the ideas that we may talk about. So we're coming down to our closing minutes here, and Phillipa, I'd like to sort of hand the last word over to you. Before I do, I just want to encourage everybody listening here to get involved in the work of Braver Angels if you care about bringing this country together and deepening our bonds as a people, regardless of your politics, race, color, creed, etc. And you can do that at braverangels.org. Learn more about our songwriting contest. If you're an artist or musician, get involved. It's a chance to showcase your music and to contribute to this great project of bringing the country together in a heart. And so, Phillipa, last word to you. What do you in looking forward for your own work? Where are you hoping that it takes you? And you know, how do you feel about the moment that we're in?
Thank you so much, John, for having me, because I feel so energized by conversations like this, and so I want to take that energy out into the world. But I want to expand a little bit about something on what Luke said to kind of finish us off. But you know, yes, we have different, I think we should celebrate the differences we have between us. You know, as I've been traveling around the country, our central question that we ask people in the art and in the dinner conversations in this project called Looking for America, the central question is, what does it mean to be American in your community? And the answers are varied, and the answers can be the same, and it's amazing. And I think, you know, I can't remember the name of this book that came out a couple years ago, but it basically says that there are 11 different countries in our one big country, because there literally is so much diversity here, and it's amazing. And that's sort of the message I want to like send out into the world, and I want to like embody myself, is I don't want to just hang out with people just like myself. That's kind of boring to me. I want to know about people who are different than me, who think differently from me. That's interesting. And I want to celebrate those differences. And so that's, for me, what I want to take out into the world is, let's acknowledge that there are differences. Awesome. That's so cool. While we like find our common ground in order to at least begin the conversations. I think that's a good beginning point. But thank you so much. I just am thrilled that we're able to have this conversation together, and that maybe there's some collaboration that could happen from this.
I think so. I definitely think so. And yeah, thank you so much for being on with us, Phillipa. I don't think it's the last time that folks are going to hear from you here at Braver Angels. Sage, Luke, always a pleasure. And everybody else, check out our next podcast coming up next week. Join the effort, get involved. We are building a house united. Stay tuned.